Well, hello everyone, it's John Laughland here. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to be joined this week by Simon Elmer. Simon, you've been on a couple of times before. You're based in Hong Kong. The last time you came on, we talked about China. You just spent some time there, and of course, you effectively live in China, albeit in the special administrative region of Hong Kong. But the time before when you came on, which must be about a year ago now, we talked about the Great Replacement, and at that stage your book was in preparation, and now it's finished. Now you've published it. It's available online. We'll post a picture of the cover. There it is. It's coming online right now, and there'll be a link where people watching can buy it if they want, as I'm sure they will after listening to you. The book is called The Great Replacement and the Islamisation of Britain. My recollection from our conversation about a year ago, Simon, if that was how long ago it was, when we talked about this subject, the Great Replacement, was that we concentrated, I think, if I remember correctly, mainly on migration, which of course is a huge issue, and it concerns not just Britain, but also many other countries in Europe and no doubt the United States as well. But in your book, you've put a subtitle, The Islamisation of Britain. Now, these are surely two different issues, but you've chosen to put them together, at least in the title of your book, and I assume obviously in the contents as well. Why did you want to concentrate on the Islamisation, which is presumably only one aspect of the Great Replacement?
Yeah, it's a very good question, John. Thank you. When I spoke to you last time, I had actually published what was the first edition of my book, which, if I just hold it up here, you can see.
Yeah,
it's quite a small book. It's about 150 pages, and it was simply called The Great Replacement. And it did have a subtitle, which was Conspiracy Theory or Immigration Policy.
That's right. That's right. Sorry, that had slipped my mind. That's right.
When that was published in November 2024, the general consensus in the media, it still is to a certain extent, is the Great Replacement, as it's always described, is a conspiracy theory of white supremacy, racism, Islamophobia, and all that sort of stuff. And if you remember from our conversation, I'm sure you do, my aim in the first edition of the book was to show that it wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was a UN policy, and it had been written into UN compacts and European ones as well. And I particularly wanted to show what the economic motivation for that was, which I think, as you very succinctly summed it up, that the profits of bringing workers from immigrant workers into the UK was that the profits would be privatized and the costs of doing so, of housing and so on and so forth, would be socialized.
Yeah.
Since then, that was November 2024, so it's over a year ago. Since then, I kind of looked at what was happening to the UK, and it seemed very apparent that this wasn't sufficient as an explanation of what was going on.
Yeah.
What was actually the motivation of importing in millions of immigrants, largely from South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa? I think, as you pointed out in our discussion, you were kind of curious. You sort of said, but we don't have enough jobs for all these people. We don't have anything like that. For every worker who comes in, there's a wife, there's kids, there's parents, there's dependents. And it's become very apparent, the other day, what was his name? The owner of, what's his name, made a statement that, the UK is being colonized by immigrants.
Yeah.
And he pointed out, Jim Ratcliffe, wasn't it? Yes, the owner of Manchester United. He's a billionaire. He pointed out that there are 9 million people on benefits in the UK. So this corroborated the fact that there isn't only an economic motivation to the corporations who are paying for these immigrants to come across and move to England.
Yeah.
I also had a lot of response. So that was, first of all, observing that the economic model that I'd developed or proposed to explain the Great Replacement wasn't sufficient. I also had a lot of people writing to me who'd read the first edition and said, is that all? Is there anything going on in addition to that? Over the last year, it's become apparent that the UK, it's become apparent to many of us, I think, is falling further and further under the influence of Islam.
Yes.
Impossible to believe that that is for many people. I think when I started this book, I came up, let me show you the new book. The new book, you saw the other one, the new book, this is the type of, you also see it's a considerably larger book.
Yeah, 400 pages, It's
400 plus pages. The first part is simply merely this is about replacement immigration, has been expanded and brought up to date with the figures, and a little bit added. But the second part now is actually, I started it as an addendum. I thought it would be something I'd kind of tack onto the bottom, the end of the book. It's actually now turned into a 230-page addendum, which is now part 2 of the book itself. And in that, I started off with what I thought was a hypothesis. And my hypothesis was based on my observations of what was happening in England, but also the research that I'd been conducting between the publication of the first edition and my beginning of writing the second edition towards the end of last year. And my hypothesis was this. I think millions and millions, I don't think, I know that millions and millions of Britons living in the UK, this strange polity that we call the UK now, much as we do the USA, are confused at why it is that not merely immigrants, but particularly Muslims living in Britain, first and second generation, seem to be placed above British people. Their culture and their religion is promoted, whereas ours is shut down.
Yeah.
Treated quite clearly differently by the police, who communicate them through their elders and their community leaders. When they commit the crimes that they do, and they commit them at far greater rates and far more violent crimes than the British people, they seem to be given suspended sentences or sentences which are no mere way commensurate with the seriousness of the crime. As I said, their religion seems to be promoted enormously. They seem to be funded in vast sums of the British taxpayers. And they seem to be receiving, well, they don't seem to be, they quite clearly are receiving preferential treatment in our politics, in our culture, in our education, by our police, under our laws. And I thought, and I think everyone's confused by this, why is this being done? So I came up with a proposition, which I then wanted to explore, and that is that the UK is, to a certain extent and to different degrees, already operating under Sharia law. Now, I looked at that as a hypothetical because it seemed so ludicrous. How could the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the 6th largest economy in the world, be operating under Sharia law? What does that actually mean? How's that actually possible? It certainly hasn't been declared. It's not officially done. There are no acts of parliament which say this. And I did this by, first of all, looking at an act of parliament, not our parliament, but the Pakistani parliament, the Parliament of Pakistan, which introduced an act in 1991 called the Enforcement of Sharia Law Act, or Sharia Act, 1991, which was passed into law in Pakistan. And it has a series of sections about what this means to the laws of Pakistan. Now, this is important for us because the Islamization of Britain is being done on the model of Pakistan. This is partly because most of the Muslims living in Pakistan and living in the UK and being imported come from Pakistan. But more importantly, the Muslims who are, or rather the immigrants who are in power in the various levels of governance of the UK, in our parliament, in the government, the cabinet itself, particularly at a council level, but also through NGOs as well. Maybe we'll get onto this, but Muslims have an enormous number, dozens and dozens, scores possibly, of NGOs at every level of civil society in the UK. And those figures are overwhelmingly from Pakistan. The Muslims are overwhelmingly from Pakistan. And it seemed to me that the model of the Islamization of Britain was that of Pakistan itself. This law was only in 1991. We don't have time to go through the kind of political history of Pakistan. But it's interesting, I think, I read the effects that imposing Sharia law on the judicial and political system on the government system of Pakistan, the effects it has had on that society itself. For instance, more liberal aspects, more liberal sides of Pakistan have tried to liberalize the country. They've tried to repeal acts which were passed by former dictators there. And because the country is now under Sharia law, things like trying to pass laws which prohibit the violence against women, for instance, which is prescribed under Islamic law, under Sharia law, have been stopped. People who have tried to repeal acts by former dictators, they have not been able to go through government because the country is now under Sharia law. So this suggested to me, first of all, a way in which I could explore this hypothesis. In what ways is Britain, not merely in its politics, but in the civil society, in our culture and education, effectively operating under Sharia law. And how has what's happened to Pakistan tell us something about not only where Britain is going, if we continue this trajectory, which we are, but also why we're doing it. I think the biggest barrier, if you like, to people accepting, there's many, accepting the idea that Britain is undergoing a process of Islamization and is increasingly falling under the practices and the precepts of Islamic law, is the disbelief of why we would be doing that, what benefit it is to anyone to place one of the great liberal democratic societies in the world under such a system of governance and education and culture.
Before we get onto the cui bono, you've said that there is a law in Pakistan which establishes Sharia over the laws of that state, but there isn't such an act in Britain. So why is the Pakistani model relevant to Britain?
Well, I think first of all it's useful because you can see what the effects, you can actually see it written into law, what it means for a country to go under Sharia law. There are, as we know, there's about 50, there's different counts, but there's about 50 Muslim majority countries in the world. There's very different degrees of how much they are Islamized. Some of them simply have Islam, but have Islam as the state religion.
Yes.
Several of them are actually Islamic states. I think there's 8 actually Islamic states. Afghanistan.
And some of them are secular states like Turkey,
some
theoretically.
Of them for instance, theoretically. I think all of them are categorized, except for 3, as military dictatorships. Pakistan is an Islamic state. It's got the worst of the worst. And in my book, I go through various examples of the obscenities of what it means for particularly women, but for lots of people to live under Sharia law. It becomes the ultimate law. If I can read out to it, one of the statements about what Sharia law actually means is that the interpretation, if you like, Sharia means the injunctions of Islam as laid down in the Holy Quran and the Sunnah become the supreme law of Pakistan. Yeah. And if ever there's any question of a judge or of any judicial body making a decision about interpreting those laws, they must always follow the interpretation which is corroborated by Sharia itself.
Yeah.
The laws themselves means that all laws are to be interpreted in the light of Sharia, that all citizens, all Muslim citizens, in Pakistan is something like 98% Muslim, have to observe Sharia, that there is teaching of training of citizens, particularly legal students, in Sharia, that education is Islamified, that the economy is Islamified, that mass media must promote Islamic values. These are kind of the key headline ones. If we look at what's going on in the UK at the moment, where Sharia is being promoted, Islam is being promoted at this level simply as a religious belief under this kind of woke model of diversity and inclusivity, merely as a kind of a religion to explore. It is increasingly being promoted in not just our media and our politics, but in our cultural industries, and particularly in our education. This is one of the things that I think concerns people most of all, that for reasons that have never been made clear to us and have never received any sort of consent or mandate from the British people or the parents, students, children, school children are being indoctrinated into the precepts of Islam at this point, merely in the interest of diversity. The thing is, as we all know, Islam is not a diverse religion.
Yeah,
it's an autocratic.
But that still doesn't show the entry into force of Sharia law into Britain. You can promote Islam by colonizing educational institutions, schools, and so on. You can promote it through NGOs. Yes, I get that. But for instance, it's been said now for some decades, or at least, well, let's say at least a decade, that there are Sharia courts operating in Britain. That would be an indication of Sharia law actually being in force if, through some form of communitarianism, the British state allowed Sharia courts to operate for, I don't know, family law or whatever. Is that the case in Britain?
Yes, there's at least 85 known Sharia courts operating in Britain. When people bring this up, the defense of it is that these are simply being used to adjudicate over family law, which a lot of countries in the world That's what it does. It does things like inheritance, marriage, divorce, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
I don't believe that's the way they're operating in the UK. We know for a fact that, for instance, they are overseeing child marriages, for instance. I've got figures in the book about the numbers of forced marriages, genital mutilation of women, and so on and so on, and other kind of obscenities, which are being overseen by these Sharia courts. I think, to answer your question...
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt, Simon. You say child marriages or whatever, but those marriages are not legal in Britain. So surely I have to press you on this, because you're saying Sharia law is in force, but you can't have more than one wife, you can't have an underage wife and so on in British law. So in what sense is the Sharia law in force in Britain?
I think that's the problem. We're operating within two legal systems in Britain. Clearly, there is no act of parliament that I've read, and I read them quite regularly, that is called something like an enactment of Sharia law. What we can look at, though, is the evidence. Why is it that England or Britain appears to be implementing the precepts, if not the laws themselves, but the principles and the judgments of Sharia within our legal system? But it's not only restricted to legal system. As I said, it's looking at our politics. It's quite clear that we've got something like 26 Muslim MPs in our parliament, and we've got about 19 lords as well. But they are extraordinarily active. They go across different parliamentary parties, but they're all unified in promoting laws, if you like. One of the laws that we are going to be coming into at the moment is the blasphemy laws. It started off as a law on Islamophobia. It's been watered down, or it's been rebranded as anti-Muslim. If it does go through, and it will go through because it's very close to going through, it won't actually be statutory at the moment. I think this is the point. Islam spreads, if you like. All Muslims have an obligation under the Quran, under the Sunnah, and under the Hadith to conquer non-Islamic states. It's written into their laws, It's written into the Quran. And it's very foolish of us just to think otherwise. Nearly a quarter of the globe at the moment are Muslims. It's an extraordinarily expansive kind of ideology. I think it's best to call it than a religion. It's clearly not going to operate that way in the UK because we haven't been conquered yet. Once we do fall under Islam officially, then I'm sure, no doubt, like we'll have in Pakistan or in places like Lebanon, for instance, then they will start introducing explicitly Sharia laws into the legislation of the country. But if we look at the evidence of this being operating not through acts of parliament, but through programs of indoctrination, this allows us, this I think goes some way to explaining why it is that our schools are promoting Islam, why it is that after Jim Radcliffe made this statement that England was being colonized by immigrants, he didn't even mention Islam, actually. Every single large football team, football club in the country made a statement denouncing what he said as racist and Islamophobic and stuff. But also after that, they held a call to prayer in Old Trafford Ground itself. Why is the king holding iftar celebrations in Windsor Castle?
But again, those are. I mean, I certainly regard those sorts of things as deplorable, and but I mean, they're Europe-wide. The Dutch Queen attended the whatever they call the ceremony of the breaking of the fast at the end of the day in Ramadan recently. So yes, the king hosted this thing at Windsor Castle, and I didn't know about the thing in the football stadium. And these are, yes, I agree, these are examples of promotion of Islam. I think rather craven promotion, particularly since, as we know, the happy Ramadan signs and wishes tend to get more publicity than any reference to Lent, even though this year, of course, the two, oddly enough, started at the same time. But is that not a reflection of the fact that Christianity is effectively non-existent in Britain? Britain is one of the, I mean, I live in France. It's pretty minority practice in France, but Britain really beats every other, I think almost every other European state in terms of the collapse of Christian practice. As I understand it, there are on Sundays, well, let's be generous, I think about 600,000, 700,000 Anglicans or Protestants in church, about slightly more Catholics, I believe. But that's I don't know how many Muslims there are in the mosque on Friday, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was higher than those figures. What do we? So firstly, I'm distinguishing between, if you like, let's say a natural process, a natural in the sense that now that these people are here, and nature abhors a void, a religious void in this case, then this is I totally agree with you about, of course, the Muslims have a vocation to convert and to conquer. I totally agree with that. But is it not, on the one hand, the result of the fact, for instance, on Ramadan and Lent, nobody practices Lent. There's no public. Lent has never been practiced apart from in I don't know, you may have the occasional penitential procession or whatever in Catholic countries, but Lent is not practiced, is it, in the way that Ramadan is? So Ramadan is practiced collectively. So people at the end of the fast, they get together and they have a big dinner together. I've forgotten what that is called, but there's no equivalent of that in Lent. So is it just not a natural process in as much as these populations are here and their practices are more public and communal? And a second question, what about the non-Muslims who are also relatively, and indeed anti-Muslims who are relatively powerful in Britain as well? I'm thinking, of course, of the Indians, the non-Muslim Indians, the Hindu Indians. How do we square that with the Islamization of Britain? Because they're not a negligible quantity.
No, there's actually more Indians coming in than there are Pakistanis into the country over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. There's also a lot of Nigerians as well.
Yes.
I think...
But some of the Nigerians are probably Muslims.
Yes. I mean, it's Nigeria is something like 57% Muslims as well.
That's
A
right.
lot of the Indians might be as well. Also, it's got a huge Muslim population. I think the idea of natural is that the first part of my book, the reason I didn't publish this as 2 books, why didn't I just add another book called The Islamization of Britain? Why put them together? Is because I see the Islamization of Britain as being as deliberate a policy as the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement isn't, it's called replacement immigration. That's the name of the UN document. It's not mass migration. It is replacement immigration. It is a very carefully calculated policy. And the documents that show that it is a policy and how it gets then trickled down from the UN to the EU, then to the UK and all the other nation states of Europe, show that they've taken great pains to make sure that it has a hegemonic application through Parliament, councils, right down to the very bottom. So there's nothing natural about the replacement immigration. No. And I also don't think there is about the Islamization of Britain itself. The actual proportional representation in Britain is quite low. There's something like, I think about, my estimation, about 4.5 million Muslims in Britain at the moment. They make up still only something like 6% of the population. It's quite clear that their representation and their influence in our parliament, in our government, in our laws, in our culture, education, and throughout civil society is many, many times greater than their proportional representation. So there's nothing natural about they're here, so therefore they're simply celebrating this. If you at the moment it is Lent, and yet London is, most of the UK is decked with Ramadan celebrations. Recently we had the BBC with the kind of so there's nothing natural, there's nothing proportional about people coming in as a natural process of immigration into Europe, and therefore they're simply celebrating their stuff. That simply doesn't. I don't think there's anyone in Britain who is not from the woke left who thinks that is the case. It's quite clear that this is being imposed upon us, forced upon us even. So I reject the idea of the natural. I do take your point about, I mean, I was looking at the figures in Europe. Between 2010 and 2020, Europe lost close to 50 million, something like 48.5 million Christians. And most of them were lost not to Islam, but to atheism.
Yes.
It's mostly atheism that's going away. Woke, I think, has worked to create a kind of a vacuum of values. Also, Christians are getting much older. The average age of a Christian in Europe is something like 48. It's literally a
Yes.
dying religion, whereas
Yes.
Islam is much, much younger.
Yes.
One could, if we're looking at reasons for why it might be of anyone's interest to Islamify Europe and the UK, because UK is at the forefront of this, but it's happening in France, it's happening in Germany, it's happening across Europe
Absolutely.
too, certainly in Western Europe. I think we have to drop the idea that this is a natural representation thing and say, well, what benefit does it have? One of the
Yeah.
benefits it has is that in this vacuum of values, which woke has done a lot to eat away, because woke
Yeah.
is we both agree that it's a destructive ideology. It destroys unity, it creates division, it breaks down the family, it breaks down a national sense of belonging or identity. All it does is destroy. Now, into that wasteland, if you want to call it, into that scorched earth, which woke and its progenitors, multiculturalism, etc., etc., etc. That what of that is created over the last 20 or 30 years. Islam is now being brought in as a new system of ideological control. In one of the things I've done in my book is I've looked at the countries in the world which are under different degrees of Islamic rule, particularly on Pakistan. They are almost all without, as I said, apart from Turkey, Lebanon, which is falling into it, and Indonesia, they're all military dictatorships. Pakistan is now ranked the 10th lowest country in the world for democracy rating. It's an appalling country. Most of them are, and the other thing it does, I've not nearly looked at it in political terms. I've also looked at the effect it has on the people in those countries.
Yeah.
One of the things I've done is looked at the average IQ of the citizen of these different countries. Now, the measure of the IQ is by this organization who uses a kind of it's got something like 2 million different records, individual records of IQs. And it bases it on things like environment and health in a young age, on access to education, etc., etc., etc. It particularly has focus on the educational upbringing of a child. And what it shows is that in Islamic countries, compared to, it's also, of course, about wealth, about the economics and stuff. And obviously, well, not obviously, but a lot of Islamic countries are very, very poor countries, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa, but also across South Asia as well. But what I've done is I've matched this up to the average GDP per capita of equivalent countries. And what I've found is that if you get a country which is a Muslim majority country, and you compare it to a non-Muslim country with a similar GDP per capita, Islam creates a population which is 10 points and more lower compared to the non-Muslim country. If you want to rule over a military dictatorship, if you want to rule over a people who see their submission as justified by the edicts of an unassailable authority, a god, if you want a country which has got, which is culturally dead, and which culture, the spaces of culture, the spaces of thought and debate, of intellectual endeavor, are completely taken over and colonized by a medieval religion, which has never gone through an enlightenment or a reformation, Islam is your ideology of choice. And across the world, we can see that it has been very carefully selected by countries in order to create that kind of social and political compact. England is, I think at the moment, sorry, I keep saying England, Britain. I like to make a distinction between Britain and the UK. UK is the polity that we live under. Britain is the actual place and the people in it. Britain has been under assault, I think, for its identity, financially, politically, culturally, for a very long time, at least 30 years, perhaps longer, undoubtedly longer. And Islam has come in to colonize and to replace the role that was occupied by before, partly by Christianity, because we are a Christian society, but culturally and politically, intellectually, if you like, we've been a secular liberal society for a very long time. Unfortunately, liberal secularism wasn't able to defend us and propose an alternative argument to our colonization by woke. We've talked about this before. Woke for me is a neo-Puritan movement of reformation, and it has stripped Europe of its values.
Yeah.
And our liberalism and our secularism hasn't been able to stand up to it. We weren't able to. Indeed, most of the organizations and institutions and figures who represented liberal secularism have actually gone and joined woke, to their internal shame. And what they've done is they've stripped Europe, and particularly Britain, of its ability to resist Islam. And that's why all of our cultural institutions, all of our political parties, all of our educational institutions, all of our media are now promoting Islam, in quite openly, I think, at the moment. Under this woke ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. But the thing is, Islam is not diverse, it is not inclusive, and it is not equitable.
What is the link, in your view, between wokeism or leftism generally and Islam? Are they opposites? Are they, or are they somehow, as Marx would say, objective allies? We've just had the by-election in Manchester, in Britain, where the Green Party, led by a Jewish gay guy and represented in the constituency by a ethnically white English woman, was elected, as we understand, largely by the Muslim population of that constituency. And this phenomenon, okay, it's one-off, but it may repeat itself elsewhere. This phenomenon in France, where I live, is referred to as Islamo-gauchism, so Islam leftism, Islamo-leftism. And in Britain, in France, it's a very substantial political force in the form of the political party France Unbowed, La France Insoumise, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which is I haven't got figures for the numbers of Muslims in France who support it, but it is, let's say, a large part of its appeal, as with the Greens in Britain, comes from the leftist attachment to the Palestinian cause and hostility to Israel and so on. Wokeism, on the face of it, should be an enemy of Islam. But you said a moment ago that it, I think you used scorched earth or something like that. You said that it's burnt its way through our existing traditions, our liberal traditions. What is it then? Are the wokes the John the Baptist for the Islamization, or is this some strange Marxist dialectic? How do we understand the link between wokeism and Islamism, or if there is one?
I think it's the key to our present. I've been saying this for quite some time. You've got a...
Hi, Jam.
Hello, Jeremy. How are you?
My apologies. I got the time all wrong.
We've been chatting away in your absence. Yes, we're just talking about this seemingly inexplicable alliance between Islam and the woke left, as I call them. I really do think it's the key to our present. It's the key in the sense that I try to draw a kind of historical model that woke and its progenitors, multiculturalism, critical race theory, political correctness, etc., diversity, all that sort of stuff, has shredded, if you like, that liberal secular kind of consensus under which most of Europe has operated, certainly Western Europe, for quite some time. And it has kind of cleared the way for our colonization, not simply demographically, but intellectually, culturally, religiously, by Islam. It's also got a more, I think, is what you're talking about, is the is the political model that it presents as well. It seems that the more complex our politics get, the more eagerly people are to make their judgments according to the left-right paradigm. So that if anyone has a decision about what's going on, for instance, in Iran right now, or what's been going on in Palestine, Israel, or what is going on in Ukraine, they will simply look at where the left stands on it. I think part of the success of Islam as a colonizing force, which it has been for many, many years, about 1400 years actually, is its recent ability to identify the left as the fifth column, I think, within Europe. The left has now more sort of mutated into a kind of anarchism, I think, where it doesn't recognize boundaries. You've got quite rational people, seemingly rational people in the UK going on marches crying no borders, no countries, which is a kind of an extraordinary thing. That there's certainly, I guess there's some sort of origins to that, and kind of, the sort of the Communist International, this idea that the working people of all nations will kind of come together, and that the nationalism keeps us fighting each other and all that. But now it's gone into a kind of an anarchist model that all borders are bad. It seems to me it seems to most people a completely unworkable kind of a politics to have. But it suits Islam very well.
Yes, now, I agree.
Islam doesn't recognize borders between countries, not because it's anarchist, but because Islam doesn't recognize the existence of any state which is not Muslim.
That's exactly what I was going to say, and that's also been my belief for a long time, that there is a link between the two, and it's exactly what you've just said. You can put it another way and say that both leftism and Islam are hostile to nation statehood. Because obviously in Islam there's the notion of the ummah, of the Islamic world or Islamic people, or whatever you call it. The word nation is probably not correct. It is a globalist religion. None of the states, you mentioned the 50 or so, I think there are 59 states in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The more let's put it this way, I don't know them all, so perhaps I shouldn't generalize, but let me hazard this let me put this theory to you. You talked about a hypothesis earlier, that the more Muslim they are, the less national they are, and the more national they are, the less Muslim. Obviously we can see this dialectic in, for instance, Turkey, where until the arrival of Erdogan, the policy of the state was very nationalistic. Ataturk was a nationalist. He set up a nationalist system with a strong army and so on, and tried to create a Turkish nation state instead of an Ottoman Empire. Similarly, in the Arab countries like Syria and Iraq and so on, you had secular Arab nationalist movement, or in Egypt, of course, under Nasser. And then those national movements in the various countries have been progressively supplanted, of course, instead by Islamism, including in the case of Turkey, which, not surprisingly now, and now for more than a decade at least, has had what some people call a neo-Ottoman policy. So yes, I would say that wokeism and Islam, from the point of view of the conflict, if there is one, between states and globalization, between nation states on the one hand and world government on the other, they are in fact on the same side in that battle.
There's a very interesting book trilogy by Kevin MacDonald, the third of which is called The Culture of Critique.
Yes.
And it's a phenomenal piece of literature in which he, just as an addendum, makes a very similar argument, but about Jewish influence over the West. And he argues that it's in the best interests of, you've got to be careful now, Jew, Israel, Zionist, it becomes quite muddied. But he argues that it's in the best interest of Israel to have open borders everywhere around the world, excepting for Israel. And the reason for this is because of the Samson idea of, should Israel face an existential threat, the citizens of Israel would need to be able to enter any country. So they favor and have influenced, for example, the US to have looser borders.
I mean, I think going back to, I'll get to what you just said there, German, because I think it's an important thing, particularly what's been going on in the UK, these kind of 2.5 years of protests now that we had, and what effect that's having. But to go back to your, as you said, numerous states which are now under a kind of a much more explicit Islamic rule, have tried at various points in the 20th century to set up a kind of nominally socialist but more secular society. As you said, Ataturk was the kind of the model of that. And it was hoped at the time that that would spread across the Middle East. It did a little bit in Egypt and so on. But it was, those states were very quickly, same thing in Iran, they were overthrown by, I guess there's no other name for it really, I guess Western imperialism. And there's a reason for that. When you have a dictatorship, and a very particular kind of dictatorship, but a religious dictatorship, if you like, it's much easier when you've got a completely autocratic government which has absolute control over its people. It's much easier then to extract out of those countries the reason that the West is interested in those countries in the first place, which is for its natural resources, particularly its oil and its gas and so on and so forth. If we're trying to see how that might explain what's going on in the UK, what interest do globalists have in reducing Europe to a similar state? Well, what does Europe have? We know that Europe is on the way down economically now. It looks like it's unable to organize itself sufficiently to compete with the US, with China, perhaps even with the growing economies of Brazil and India and so on. We don't have the natural resources now that we used to have through our colonization of the rest of the world. We don't seem to have a workforce which is willing to do the sort of jobs that they want us to do. So what's the point of placing the UK under Islam? I think one of the things is to go back to this term, the Great Replacement. I don't think they want to. I think what they want to do is to get rid of us. I think the British people, in the next generation, I think will be down to 30 million. And I think we'll go down that inevitably, and eventually to be ethnic cleansed from our own country. It's been done in other countries. It can be done to us. The point of moving large numbers of Muslims into the UK, I mean, I think it's important, sorry, to go back. Israel or Palestine is a very good example of how a country is conquered. When the state of Israel was declared in 1947, the proportion of the population which was Jewish was still quite small. You don't need to have a majority population of any one religion or race or ethnicity or whatever to take over that country if you have the backing of the UN behind you and the countries that make up that. And that's exactly what replacement immigration has. It has the backing of the most powerful countries in the world and its transnational technocracies like the UN and the EU. So I think it won't be long now before the UK does actually officially fall under Islam, because the British people themselves have been so not really disenfranchised, but actually we've had everything that makes us British erased. Recently I was looking up some figures, and in the 2021 census, people were asked to identify what they were, and only 10% of the population said they were English. Most of them said they were English and British, but only 10% of the population. Now, the English make up, something like 80% of the population, the white British population the British population of the UK. Sorry, these figures, let me say that again.
It may be more than 80%. Scotland is tiny. It's only 5 million people, Scotland.
Okay, so something is like 85% of the English people make up the British population of the United Kingdom. It's a bit confusing, all this to foreign people, these differences. But only 10% said they were. So that's kind of evidence that the English people now don't really exist.
Simon, John, you could don't say anything because I've asked you this in the past. Simon, what does it mean to be British?
Yes. Well, I've actually tried to answer that in my book. A lot of the book is about. I look at the evidence of Islamization. I develop a kind of a legal model for it. But in the last part of the book, I actually make a good trend to say what can we do about it. And one of the things I found myself having to discuss and talking about, how do we save Britain? How do we stop Britain becoming an Islamic state? How do we stop the British people becoming replaced in their own country? Is, well, what are the British people then? And I found it very interesting to kind of address it. I'm not going to be able to do it here. You'll have to buy the book, Jeremy, because there's about 50 pages of it. I think one of the distinctions which is very interesting is that nowadays, for a long time now, to be British officially is you have a British passport, you have British citizenship. Now, British citizenship is granted to anyone by the Home Secretary. As soon as they give it to you, you're now officially British. Unfortunately, a lot of British people don't believe that. They don't believe that as soon as you walk into the country, you're given a passport or you're given residency there and you're called British, that you suddenly become British. As you guys know, I live in China. I've been living here for 2.5 years. I have friends here who've been living here for much longer, and their children were born here and speak Chinese. But if they said they were Chinese, people would think they're mad.
Yeah.
Chinese people would say,
Yeah.
"That's ridiculous," and that
No,
happens
but-
pretty much across the world. Also,
yeah, but hang on. If you say this is where it gets weird. So you're living in China. If you become a Chinese citizen and someone asks you, "What are you?" and you say, "I'm Chinese," what goes through your mind is, no, but hold on, you don't look Chinese.
Yeah.
But if you said, "I'm British," a whole different image appears.
well, it doesn't for me. It's very clear to me what British is. It's people who are British. We've had lots of governments telling us that to be British is to have a set of values, fair play, politeness, all this sort of stuff. That's absolute rubbish, because all it means is every government can come along and say, well, we've decided that British values now is tolerance and it's inclusivity and it's tolerance of other religions. So if you're anti-Islam or if you're Islamophobic, or if you don't actually think it's a good idea that your child is told to put on a burqa or a hijab at school, suddenly you're not British. So that I can now be deprived of my Britishness. So I think associating Britishness with a quality of behavior or a set of values or a set of beliefs is a very dangerous thing. The Chinese people aren't, I don't what any other country which is not in the West. They don't have their identity decided by the government prescribing a set of behaviors and values. British is quite clear what the British are. I'll tell you. Shall I tell you what the British are? I've written it down in my book, so I can tell you what it is.
While you're doing that, didn't Douglas Murray attempt to answer this also in his book, The Strange Death of Europe?
He probably did. I haven't actually read the book. I got sort of strange views about Douglas Murray. I don't really share his politics.
He wrote that when you're still on the right side of history.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I've written, and this will get me into a lot of trouble, but I really don't care anymore. Let me see if I can talk among yourselves until I find something.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just add an addendum that it's an interesting question, because I can ask the same question: what does it mean to be South African? And I have no answer. I don't know what it means. I am a result of a combination of pretty much Britain and the Netherlands and perhaps one or two other countries. I have no way of answering that question merely by saying I happen to live on the bottom tip of Africa. That's maybe as far as I can go, and I can maybe adopt some Afrikaner culture and customs, but that's that. Yeah. I don't know what it means to be South African, so that's why I ask you the question: what does it mean to be British?
I think South Africa's got a much more complicated and more recent history compared to the British Isles, which actually includes Ireland, but leave that out for the moment. The British Isles is an island state, so I think it's actually more defined in its identity than the other countries that aren't. Have got more permeable borders. The fact that we are a kind of island state. A little while ago we had an Indian Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And a lot of people are saying, well, is he British? Well, he was born in Britain, so he must be British. We even use the phrase British born as if you could be somehow born into a nationality. Nationality means it comes from the Latin for where you're born. So does that mean if my children are born in China, they become Chinese? Of course they don't. Nobody in the world thinks that. If an American comes to England and he has children there, does his children suddenly become British? I imagine he'd say, my children are American who are born in it. It's only from people from non-Western countries who are born in Western countries suddenly undergo this magical transformation into that identity. When people were talking about whether Rishi Sunak was indeed British, he's an Indian who was born in Britain. Sadiq Khan, who is a second-generation Pakistani Muslim, who is our mayor of London for the last 14 years or something, he said Rishi Sunak is as British as his tweeds, which is a kind of a phrase that you hear, the kind of the tweed clothes that he wears. He dresses like he's, he went to, I don't think he did he go
Winchester.
To Eton? He probably did.
Winchester.
Yeah. But I thought it was very interesting he used that phrase, that Britishness is something, a kind of a masquerade, something you can put on. And because, I live over here in Hong Kong, and you often see Chinese Hong Kongers walking around here dressed up in Bond Street blazers and ties, and they look very British. But I don't think if you said to them, are you British because you dress like that? Britain is one of the few countries in the world where if you dress like a British man, suddenly you're considered to be British. But Britain is a mere masquerade. It seems to me very much like woke saying that if a man dresses up in a dress, suddenly he's a woman. It's a kind of an identity which comes from a sort of a consumer selection of, I can say today I'm this, today I'm that. This is it's interesting also that after this, though, Rishi Sunak's, one of his daughters, who was born in Britain, she said very clearly, no, I'm Indian. What did she say?
Yes.
She said it she kind of blew. Sorry, I shouldn't be quoting from my book in the middle of the conversation. She said, that's where my culture is, that's where my family is, even though she's born in Britain. And she's absolutely right. It doesn't matter.
Well, her mother, of course, is indeed from India. That's perhaps why she said it.
Very, very soon. Yes. Now, I've written here, like every nation state, only more so, given our island identity, we are defined by our ethnicity, which for the British is Celtic and Anglo-Saxon, by our history, which goes back over 2,000 years and includes far more than an empire that was second only to Rome in its influence on the world, by our culture, which is Northern European in its geographic and climatic origins, conservative in its sensibilities, and for some time now, liberal and secular in its attitudes. And although its influence is waning, by our religion, which even for atheists like myself is Christian and overwhelmingly Protestant, though with the Catholic roots of Anglicanism. That was my definition of what it is to be British, which undoubtedly will have an enormous number of people having a go at me as being blah, blah, blah. But that is it. And I think every country in the world could come up with a similar sort of definition of that. The Germans could do it, the French could do it, the Spanish could do it, the Italians could do it. Why has it suddenly become racist, whatever, for countries to say, actually, this is what we are? I've been an immigrant many times in my life. I'm one now at the moment. There's nothing wrong with being an immigrant. This magical transformation, turning what is a personal issue, like if I stay here, my children are born here, and say they have a Chinese wife or husband, their kids, what are they? That's a question, but that's for them to decide. It's a personal question. It's not a political one. But woke, which goes back to that old 60s chestnut that the personal is political, has elevated an issue which has got nothing to do with politics into a political issue because it forces nation states like Britain, like France, like European, and it's different in the US because that's not really a nation state, but the nation states of Europe to say, we don't have an identity, and therefore everyone can come in and declare that they're British.
It seems then, Simon, what you're saying is that the answer to the question is multi-layered. It's a combination of culture and politics, and of course politics would be downstream from culture. So therefore there's a whole package that comes with that answer.
I don't think it's actually that important an issue. Nowadays in the world, even before all this started, before the replacement immigration started, people kind of live together. I don't get upset if I walk around here and people stare at me because I'm a white man in a Chinese society. That's part of what being an immigrant is. It doesn't have to be elevated into an issue where everyone is permanently offended for someone saying, "Hey, there's an immigrant."
So I'm jumping in, but I agree with what you're saying. But I think it is important because identity is an integral part of who we are in our existence. We are always searching for our identity.
Yes, and unfortunately, the British people have been deprived of theirs. Because we're coming up to the end of an hour, can I talk about something? There's one other thing I want to end on, which I think goes back to what we were talking about, John. I recently read a report which was published by, interestingly, an Australian academic called Mark Dury, who is a specialist on Islam. He's published numerous books about it, and he published a report about something we haven't touched on. We can't really get into it here because we're running out of time, which is the Muslim rape gangs operating in the UK over the last sort of 5 decades and more, which has really come to a head at the moment in the UK because Rupert Lowe has just conducted independently this inquiry into it. And it's been established without doubt that there is an intimate link between the ideals, if you like, the precepts of Islam and the way that these Muslim gangs are operating, but also the fact that they have not been called out. We still don't have an national inquiry into the UK now, even though it's estimated that maybe 100,000, maybe 500,000, maybe more children, English girls, it's actually British girls because it's obviously operating in Glasgow and across the Britain, might have fallen victim to these gangs. I think Rupert Lowe's identified something like 85 different constituencies so far. So it is a nationwide network. And one of the things he talks about, Mark Dury, in this analysis, and I really recommend this to everyone, I kind of sum some of it up in my book, is that he draws up 8 what he calls aspects of Islam which justify, in the eyes of the perpetrators, the rape of underage children, not just the rape, but the torture, the trafficking of them, the appalling abuse, which we won't go into here. And I'm not going to go into that there, but at the very end, he comes up with this concept, which he wrote an entire book about, which is called Dimitude. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, of course.
Dimitude is called, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Dimitude, dimmies are, it's a option, it's a third option, which is given to the peoples of a conquered country, people conquered by Islam. The first option is to die in war defending your country, to be killed or to killed as captives. The second is to convert to Islam. And the third is to live as dhimmis. Now,
That's
dhimmis is a entire judicial, cultural, religious, social status of subject peoples under Islam. And he says an absolutely remarkable thing at the end of his book when he's looking at what this kind of means. He says, he's talking here about the fact that with all the evidence that we have of this network of Muslim gangs, he's only focusing on this, the Muslim rape gang network, the trafficking network as well, but it could be applied to the entire Islamization of Britain and why the British people have not been able to respond to it, because our institutions have been captured. And he says here, I just want to quote him, one interpretation of the complicity of the authorities in the UK grooming gang crisis is that a kind of dhimmi civility has settled into the souls of UK authorities. This respects Islam and Muslim at all costs, while disbelieving and inculpating non-believers. Seen in this light, the authorities' inaction in response to the grooming gang crisis could be considered a milestone in the ongoing Islamization of the UK. I think it's a remarkable, when I read it, I thought it was absolutely amazing. One of the things I think that, I was having this conversation with a group of Indians that I met in a local bar around here, and they said to me, why are there so many Muslims? Because the Indians know the trouble they have with Muslims in their own country, and particularly in their borders with Pakistan, probably no one better, or some people better. And they said, why is Britain so falling under the influence of Islam? Why are there so many Muslims in positions of power, senior positions, not merely Shabana Mahmud and Sadiq Khan? And they were kind of confused about why we weren't doing something about it, why it is that we're being so easily conquered at every level of our society. And that to me suggests something very, very interesting, that the British people are already effectively dhimmis in their own society. One of the things dhimmis have to do, this subject people, is pay jizya, which is a kind of a tax. And that is paid specifically so that they can live, otherwise they get killed. If we look at the enormous amounts of money that the British people are paying now towards the government, or rather which is being extracted by the government from them, to pay for the housing, the medical care, the education, the cost, the transportation of millions and millions of immigrants, and particularly Muslims, the endless amount of money which seems to be being taken from our taxes to pay for the defense of mosques while churches are falling into disrepair. There's an enormous tax which is going on the British people to pay for the erasure of our own culture and the replacement of our people. That seems to me to describe our dimitude, our servile state within our own country. And it also describes why so many of our education and cultural institutions, around which we might hope or expect some resistance to this cultural occupation of our country to come from, are actually doing the absolute opposite. They are promoting Islam over British identity. Anyway, this is a very big topic. It's a very fat book, as you can see.
Well, I hope that
people will have a look at it.
that our viewers will want to read it, having listened to you, Simon, because as ever, it's been absolutely fascinating. The idea of the rape gangs and the various taxes as a form of dimitude is extremely powerful and, of course, very depressing. I think a lot of what you say applies to the whole of Europe. I've got lots to say on British and English national identity, but I think we can, which of course is not the same as that of, for example, a German, but all of our states, I think, are indeed disarmed. Yes, probably by wokery, but also perhaps by by other things as well. And above all, I suppose to conclude, I'm reminded listening to you of what Kenneth Clark said back in the 1960s when he tried to define civilization. He said the thing that a civilization needs above all in order to exist and prosper and grow is courage. And of course, that quality seems to be completely absent now from most European states, and not just from Britain. Simon Elmer, thank you again very much indeed, and I'm sure we'll invite you again soon. I certainly hope we will. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Thanks a lot. Bye.